Your rustic charm is a violation, Mr. Miller. This Lien is just the beginning. We will own this land, one way or another. The words hung in the crisp mountain air, colder than the October morning itself, each one a perfectly formed little dagger aimed straight at the life I had built. The woman who spoke them, HOA President Karen Bishop, stood on my side of the faded property markers, a thick sheaf of papers clutched in her hand like a scepter. She was a woman built for confrontation, wide and solid, her floral-print blouse stretched taut across a frame that seemed to absorb all the space around it, leaving none for anyone else. Her face was a mask of smug certainty, the kind worn only by those who have never been truly challenged, who believe that rules, when weaponized correctly, are a substitute for morality. The paper she thrust at me wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration of war, a lien, a $5,000 lien on my cabin, the one I built with my own hands, board by board, nail by nail, on land that had been in my name for a decade before her precious Evergreen Glade was anything more than a developer's fever dream. The crime, the stain on my cedar siding, a rich, dark walnut, was not one of the three approved shades of beige. I looked from the paper to her imperious face, then past her to the manicured lawns and identical houses of her kingdom, a sterile paradise of enforced conformity. And then I looked back at my cabin, nestled amongst the tall pines, a testament to sweat, patience, and a promise I made to myself after 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. This wasn't just my home, it was my sanctuary, and she had just desecrated it. This is the kind of HOA nightmare you hear about but never think will happen to you. If you're watching this, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now because you're going to want to see how this ends. And drop a comment below telling me where you're from and if you've ever had your own run-in with a power-tripping HOA board. Your stories matter, and trust me, after what I went through, I know how important it is to know you're not alone. Now let's get back to how this all started, long before Karen decided my property was her next conquest. It began not with a fight, but with a dream. After 2 decades of building bridges and infrastructure in places most people couldn't find on a map, I came home looking for quiet. I found it in a 20-acre parcel of untamed forest, sold to me by an old farmer named Silas Croft. The land was rugged, bisected by a clear, fast-running creek, and it was perfect. Silas was a man of the earth, his handshake as binding as any contract. When we signed the papers, he made a point of walking me to the northern edge of the property, to the source of the creek that bubbled up from a deep spring. "This here is Miller Creek now," he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder. "The water rights are tied to the deed, son. Senior rights, oldest in the county. Don't you ever let anyone forget that." I hadn't thought much of it then. To me, it was just a beautiful feature of the land. I spent the next 2 years clearing a small patch, milling some of my own timber, and building the cabin. It wasn't a mansion, it was solid, functional, and it fit the landscape. It was a place for my daughter Chloe to visit on weekends, a place where we could fish and hike and forget the noise of the world. For years, it was just that. Then the bulldozers arrived on the adjacent property, the sprawling farmland south of me. The developer called it Evergreen Glade, a name that promised nature while systematically erasing it. I watched as they scraped the land bare, laid down a grid of asphalt, and erected dozens of identical oversized houses. I didn't mind. I had my 20 acres, my buffer of trees, and my quiet. The new residents mostly kept to themselves, and I kept to mine. The first sign of trouble was a politely worded letter, slid into a plastic sleeve and left on my gate. It was an invitation to join the newly formed Evergreen Glade Homeowners Association. I politely declined. My property was not part of their development. The deed was clear. The county records were clear. I thought that was the end of it. But with HOAs, it's never the end. It's just the beginning of their slow, bureaucratic creep. They see a nail that isn't hammered down into their perfectly uniform floorboard, and they can't rest until it is. I was that nail, and Karen Bishop was the hammer. The lien notice wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a strategic move, a shot across the bow designed to intimidate, to make me feel small and legally outmatched. Karen had probably used this tactic 100 times on the residents within her jurisdiction, cowing them into submission over unapproved garden gnomes or grass that was a quarter-inch too high. She assumed I was just another homeowner, another civilian who would buckle at the sight of a legal document. She didn't know that for 20 years my job had been to analyze complex systems, identify structural weaknesses, and exploit them under extreme pressure. She had just declared war on a man who saw bureaucracy not as a maze, but as a battlefield. The first thing I did after she swaggered off my property was to call my daughter Chloe. She was in her first year of law school, and while she wasn't ready to take on a case, her mind was sharp, and she knew how to cut through the noise. A lien for a paint color, Dad? On property that's not even in the HOA? That's not just an overreach. That's legally insane. Her voice, a mix of youthful indignation and budding legal analysis, was exactly what I needed to hear. It grounded me. They can't do that, can they? I asked, pacing the floor of my cabin, the offending walnut-stained walls seeming to mock me. They can file anything, Dad, she explained. Filing it and making it stick are two different things. But it clouds your title. You can't sell the property or refinance it until it's cleared. It's a classic strong-arm tactic. They're trying to bully you into either joining the HOA and submitting to their rules or selling to them cheap. Her words confirmed my gut feeling. This wasn't about staying, it was about acquisition. My land, with its mature trees and natural creek, was an eyesore to them, a pocket of untamed wilderness ruining the sterile perfection of their suburban oasis. More than that, it was a prime piece of real estate that could be subdivided into more cookie-cutter lots. After hanging up with Chloe, I went to the heavy, fireproof safe tucked away in my closet. Inside was every important document of my life: my discharge papers, my father's medals, and a thick leather folio containing the deed and survey for my 20 acres. I spread the documents across my large oak dining table. The survey map was a thing of beauty, a detailed topography of every rise and fall of the land, every cluster of ancient oaks, and the winding path of Miller Creek. And there, in dense, archaic, legal language attached to the deed, was the section Silas had told me about: the water rights. Exclusive and senior rights to all surface water originating from and flowing through the described parcel, specifically the entirety of the body of water known as Miller Creek, for purposes of agricultural, domestic, and recreational use in perpetuity. In perpetuity. It was a powerful phrase. I traced the path of the creek on the map. It flowed from the spring on my land, wound its way through my woods, and then passed under the road and directly into the heart of the Evergreen Glade development. A sudden, cold realization washed over me. I walked outside and stood on the small bridge I'd built over the creek, watching the water rush by. Where did they get their water? The development was new and too far from the municipal line to be connected. They had to have their own system. I pulled out my binoculars and scanned the edge of their development where it bordered the county road. And then I saw it. Tucked behind a line of professionally planted fir trees was a low, cinder block building with a large pipe running from its side directly into the creek bed. A pump house, downstream from my property. They had built their entire community's water supply system, their reservoir, their filtration, their everything, dependent on the creek that I, and I alone, legally controlled. A slow, grim smile spread across my face. Karen Bishop thought she was fighting me over the color of my house. She had no idea she had just picked a fight for the very survival of her community. I went back inside and called Dave Riley. Dave had been my platoon sergeant in the Corps. He was a bulldog then, and he was a bulldog now, only his battles were fought in courtrooms instead of deserts. He'd gone to law school on the GI, Bill, and become one of the most feared real estate attorneys in the state. "Johnny boy," he boomed into the phone, "don't tell me you finally decided to sell that patch of dirt and move to Florida." "Not a chance, Dave," I said, the smile still on my face. "Actually, I think I'm about to go to war with a homeowners association." There was a pause, and then Dave let out a low whistle. "An HOA? Son, you're in more danger than you ever were with me. Those people are fanatics. This one's special, Dave. She just put a lien on my cabin." I heard the sound of a chair scraping on the other end. "She did what? On what grounds?" "Unapproved exterior stain color." Dave was silent for a full 10 seconds. I could almost hear the gears turning in his sharp legal mind. Then he burst out laughing, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the phone. "Oh, this is beautiful. They have no idea who they're messing with, do they?" "They have no idea," I confirmed. "But it gets better, Dave. They built their entire development's water system downstream from my creek." The laughter stopped abruptly. It was replaced by a tone of voice I hadn't heard since we were planning an operation outside of Fallujah. It was the sound of a predator that had just caught the scent of its prey. "John," he said, his voice low and serious, "tell me you have the senior water rights." "Oldest in the county, Dave, in perpetuity." I heard him take a deep, satisfied breath. "Oh, Karen," he murmured as if she were in the room, "you have made a catastrophic mistake." The battle for the beige was over. The war for the water was about to begin. Dave's instructions were precise, methodical, and carried the cold, calculated logic of a military operation. "Phase 1 is containment," he'd said over the phone. "We respond to their volley, but we don't reveal our main battery. Not yet. We build our case, we document everything, and we let her exhaust her own ammunition." So I spent the next week drafting a formal response to the HOA board. It was a masterclass in polite, legally fortified defiance. With Dave's guidance, I crafted a letter that was respectful in tone, but ironclad in its substance. I attached a certified copy of my deed, highlighting the date of purchase, a full 8 years before the Evergreen Glade. Covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and Rs, were even filed with the county. I included a copy of the county plat map, clearly showing my parcel, Lot 7A, as separate and distinct from the Evergreen Glade subdivision. I addressed the lien directly, stating that as my property was not, and had never been, subject to their association's governance, the lien was invalid and constituted tortious interference with my property rights. I formally requested the immediate removal of the lien and a written confirmation that the HOA would cease all further attempts to enforce its rules upon my land. I finished it with a sentence Dave had practically dictated. "Failure to comply will compel me to explore all available legal remedies to protect my property and recover any damages incurred." I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, a paper trail, Dave had insisted. Every interaction from this point forward had to be on the record. The little green card came back a few days later, signed by a K. Bishop. Then silence. For 2 weeks I heard nothing. A part of me, the part that still believed in reason and decency, hoped that was the end of it. Maybe some saner member of the board had read my letter, consulted a lawyer, and told Karen to stand down. It was a foolish hope. The response, when it came, was not a letter of apology, but a thicker envelope. Inside was a cold, dismissive letter stating that their legal counsel had reviewed the matter and found that, due to the integrated nature of the community, my property was implicitly subject to the aesthetic and safety standards of the association. It was legal nonsense, a smokescreen of jargon designed to sound official while meaning nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. Tucked behind the letter were 3 new violation notices. The first was for my driveway. The crushed stone I'd laid down was not an approved paving material, like the asphalt or interlocking bricks used in Evergreen Glade. Fine, $1,500. The second was for the stone fire pit I'd built near the creek, a place where Chloe and I had roasted marshmallows on countless summer nights. It was an unapproved permanent structure and potential fire hazard, despite being 100 yards from the nearest building and surrounded by a stone patio. Fine, $2,000. The third violation was the most insulting. My small vegetable garden, a neat patch of raised beds where I grew tomatoes, zucchini, and herbs, was cited for unmanicured landscaping and agricultural use inconsistent with community standards. Fine, $1,000. The total of the new fines was $4,500, and the letter helpfully informed me that these were being added to the initial $5,000 lien, along with daily late fees of $50 per day, retroactive to the date of the first notice. My blood ran cold. This was no longer just a strong-arm tactic, it was a campaign of annihilation. They weren't just trying to make me conform, they were trying to bankrupt me, to bury me under a mountain of fabricated debt until I had no choice but to surrender my land. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. Citing my vegetable garden as a violation while their entire community drank from my creek was a level of hypocrisy so profound It was almost art. I called Dave immediately, my voice tight with a fury I hadn't felt in years. I read him the list of new violations. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Good. She's arrogant. She's overconfident. She's creating a beautiful, detailed record of harassment and bad faith. Every one of these bogus notices is another nail in her own coffin." "It doesn't feel that way, Dave," I said, looking at the bill, which now totaled over $10,000 with the fees. "It feels like they're winning." "Trust the strategy, John," he said, his voice firm. "This is the bureaucratic firefight. They're trying to overwhelm you. We are not going to engage on their terms. We don't argue about the driveway or the fire pit. Arguing legitimizes their authority. We continue to build our primary case. It's time for phase 2, reconnaissance." His plan was simple. I was to become an expert on the Evergreen Glade HOA. He wanted me to get a copy of their CC&Rs, their bylaws, the minutes from their last year of board meetings, all of which were technically public record for the members. "But I'm not a member," I pointed out. "No," Dave said, a sly grin in his voice. "But you're about to find some friends who are." He was right. It was time to stop being a hermit on a hill and start understanding the community that was trying to destroy me. I needed to know who else Karen had targeted. An enemy this brazen rarely has only one victim. Her reign of terror had to have a history, and I was going to uncover it. That evening, I put on a clean jacket and drove down into the belly of the beast. I parked on one of the pristine, empty streets of Evergreen Glade. The houses were all immaculate, the lawns perfect, the silence unnatural. It didn't feel like a community. It felt like a museum exhibit. I had no idea who to talk to, so I just started walking. I was looking for a crack in the facade, a sign of life, of individuality. And then I saw it. Tucked behind a perfectly symmetrical Japanese maple, almost hidden from the street, was a small hand-painted sign that read, "Our Roses, a Labor of Love." It was next to a series of empty, dug-up flower beds. It was a sign of protest. I knocked on the door. The door was opened by a woman in her late 70s, with kind eyes clouded by a deep sadness. Her name was Eleanor Gable. When I introduced myself as the man who owned the cabin up the creek, her eyes widened in recognition. "You're the one," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "Karen is telling everyone you're trying to cut off our water." She invited me in, and over cups of weak tea, she told me her story. For 30 years, she and her late husband had cultivated prize-winning roses. When they moved to Evergreen Glade to be closer to their grandchildren, they'd spent a fortune creating a magnificent rose garden in their backyard. Last spring, she'd received a notice from the HOA. A new landscaping rule passed by the board under Karen's leadership had banned all thorny decorative shrubbery due to an unsubstantiated claim that it posed a risk to children. The real reason, Eleanor suspected, was that Karen's own meticulously manicured but sterile garden couldn't compete with the Gables' vibrant display during the annual community garden tour. Eleanor was given 30 days to rip them all out. She'd fought it, appealed to the board, and presented letters from horticultural societies. In response, Karen had tripled the daily fines until Eleanor, a widow on a fixed income, had no choice but to hire a landscaper to uproot and destroy decades of work. The little sign in her yard was her only remaining act of defiance. Her story filled me with a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about a bully who used procedural power to inflict pain. As I left Mrs. Gable's house, she pressed a piece of paper into my hand. "It's a list," she whispered. "Others. Be careful." The list contained 4 names and phone numbers. Over the next week, I met with each of them, hearing variations of the same story. There was the Rodriguez family, a young couple with 2 kids who were fined $2,000 because their son's portable basketball hoop was visible from the street for 3 hours after the 6 p.m. storage deadline. There was Marcus, a disabled Air Force veteran who was in a protracted battle over the specific grade and color of the ramp he'd had to install on his front porch. The HOA-approved contractor was twice as expensive as the one his VA benefits would cover, but Karen wouldn't grant an exception. And there was a young artist who was being hounded for running a small online business, selling her paintings from her home, a violation of the No Home-Based Commercial Enterprises Clause, even though no customers ever came to her house. Each one had been isolated, made to feel like they were the problem, and slowly bled dry by fines and legal threats. Karen's strategy was textbook divide and conquer. As I gathered their stories, Dave was doing his own reconnaissance. He'd driven to the county planning office and pulled the developer's original plans for Evergreen Glade, along with all the geological surveys and environmental impact reports. He spread them out on the conference table in his office, and what he'd found was damning. They knew, Dave said, tapping a faded engineer's note from 15 years ago. The developer's own hydrologist flagged it right here. Development is contingent on securing senior water rights from Parcel 7A. They knew they needed my rights from the very beginning. They either forgot, or more likely, the developer went bankrupt before he could purchase them from Silas, and the bank that took over the project just missed it. The HOA, in its blind arrogance, had inherited a ticking time bomb and had no idea. They had built a $100 million community on a foundation of sand, completely dependent on the goodwill of a landowner they were now trying to destroy. "This is it, John," Dave said, his eyes gleaming. "This is our main battery. We've let her expose her flank. We've documented her pattern of abuse. We found her critical vulnerability. It's time to stop playing defense. It's time to dictate the terms of the engagement." He began to draft a new letter. This one wouldn't be a polite request. It wouldn't mention the stain color, the driveway, or the vegetable garden. It would be a formal, legal notice, a document of such profound and devastating consequence that it would bring the entire community to a grinding halt. It was a notice of intent to exercise senior water rights. The letter was a work of art, a masterpiece of legal devastation delivered with the calm, dispassionate precision of an artillery strike. It was addressed not just to Karen, but to every member of the HOA board, and it was hand-delivered by a court process server to ensure there was no ambiguity about its receipt. The language was simple, direct, and utterly uncompromising. It began by referencing my deed in the specific, incontrovertible language of my senior water rights. It then detailed the history of the HOA's unwarranted and malicious campaign of harassment, listing every violation notice, every fine, and every threat, framing them not as a dispute over rules, but as a clear case of tortious interference. Then came the hammer blow. "Therefore," Dave had written, "be advised that pursuant to the senior rights legally attached to my property deed, I, John Miller, will be exercising my right to the full and unimpeded flow of Miller Creek for the purposes of agricultural irrigation on my land. All diversion of water from Miller Creek by the Evergreen Glade Homeowners Association, its agents, or its infrastructure is to cease and desist within 30 calendar days of the receipt of this notice. After this date, any and all diversion will be considered theft of private property, and I will take all necessary measures, including the physical reclamation of the water flow, to protect my assets." We were giving them 30 days until we turned off their water. I have to admit, my hand trembled slightly as I signed the letter. This was a massive escalation. We were moving from a defensive posture to an all-out offensive. I was no longer just fighting for my cabin. I was holding the fate of an entire community in my hands. "Are you sure about this, Dave?" I had asked him. "This is going to cause a panic." "That's the point, John," he'd replied, his voice steely. "You can't reason with a bully. You have to shatter their power base. Karen rules through fear and intimidation. We're about to show the residents of Evergreen Glade that their real enemy isn't you. It's her. Her arrogance, her incompetence, has put every single one of their homes at risk. We're not the villains here. We're the ones exposing the fatal flaw in their entire system." The process server delivered the letters on a Tuesday afternoon. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the quiet of bureaucratic delay. It was the eerie, deafening silence of a bombshell that has just been dropped. For 48 hours, there was nothing. I imagined the frantic phone calls, the emergency board meetings, the dawning horror as their own lawyer explained to them the catastrophic mess they were in. The first public sign that the bomb had detonated was an email blast sent to all Evergreen Glade residents. A copy was anonymously forwarded to me by one of my new allies. The subject line read, "Urgent community meeting, an unprecedented threat to our community." The email, written by Karen, was a masterwork of manipulative propaganda. She painted me as a greedy, vindictive recluse, an outsider who was attempting to hold our families hostage and extort the community. She twisted my legal notice into a terroristic threat, conveniently omitting the fact that this was a direct response to her own campaign of harassment. She made no mention of the lien, the fines, or the fact that my water rights were legally sound. She was framing the narrative, casting herself as the stalwart defender of the community against a monstrous villain. The meeting was scheduled for that Friday night in the community clubhouse. "You have to go," Mrs. Gable told me over the phone, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "You have to be there to tell your side." "Dave says I shouldn't," I replied. "He says it's a trap. She'll control the room. She'll have plants in the audience. It's her home turf." "Let her," Mrs. Gable insisted. "Let everyone see her for who she is. And you won't be alone. We'll be there, all of us." It was a risk, a huge risk. Walking into that room would be like walking into a lion's den. But Mrs. Gable was right. Hiding in my cabin would only reinforce the narrative Karen was spinning. Sometimes the only way to win a fight is to show up. I called Dave and told him my decision. He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said finally. "If you're going in prepared. This is an information operation, John. We're not there to win a shouting match. We're there to deploy facts. Get your binder." My binder. For the past month, I had been compiling a meticulous record of every interaction, every letter, every violation notice, every certified mail receipt. I had copies of my deed, the survey, the water rights. I had printed out the developer's original plans that David found, with the hydrologist warning circled in red. I had written statements from Mrs. Gable, the Rodriguez family, and the other victims of Karen's reign. It was a 3-inch thick testament to her abuse of power. On Friday night, I put on the same jacket I had worn in the service, the one with the Corps of Engineers castle emblem on the chest. I tucked the binder under my arm and walked out of my quiet, peaceful cabin, down the hill, and into the heart of the storm. The Evergreen Glade Community Clubhouse was exactly as I'd pictured it, sterile, beige, and smelling faintly of air freshener and simmering resentment. The room was packed, a standing room only crowd of anxious homeowners, their faces a mixture of anger, fear, and confusion. Karen stood at a podium at the front, flanked by the other 4 members of the HOA board, who all looked deeply uncomfortable, like men who knew they were about to witness a car crash in slow motion. When I walked in, a hush fell over the room. Every eye turned to me. I could feel the hostility, a palpable wave of it washing over me. In their eyes, I was the monster from the woods, the man who was going to turn off their taps and kill their property values. I ignored the stares, found a spot along the back wall, and stood at a relaxed parade rest, the heavy binder held loosely in my hand. Mrs. Gable gave me a small, encouraging nod from the front row, where she sat with the Rodriguez family and Marcus, the disabled vet. Karen let the silence hang for a dramatic moment before launching into her speech. It was a tirade, a carefully crafted performance of righteous indignation. She spoke of community values, shared responsibility, and protecting our investment. She painted a picture of a harmonious neighborhood suddenly under siege from an unreasonable outsider. "This man," she said, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at me, "this Mr. Miller has decided that his personal desires outweigh the needs of 200 families. He wants to destroy what we have built. He is threatening our children, our homes, our very way of life, all because he refuses to follow the same simple rules that bind us all together as a community." A murmur of angry agreement rippled through the crowd. She was good. I had to give her that. She knew exactly which buttons to push. She wrapped up her speech with a flourish. "But we will not be intimidated. We will not be extorted. We have retained legal counsel, and we will fight this egregious overreach with every resource at our disposal. We will not let one man's selfishness triumph over the good of the community." The room erupted in applause. It was my turn. Before I could even move, a man in the front row, clearly a plant, jumped up. "What gives you the right?" he shouted at me. "Who do you think you are?" All heads swiveled back to me. The room was a tinder box, and Karen had just lit the match. I took a slow breath, just as I'd done 100 times before in situations far more dangerous than this. I didn't shout back. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply held up the binder. "My name is John Miller," I said, my voice calm and steady, easily carrying to the back of the room. "And this is the right I have." I walked forward, not to the podium, but to an empty table near the front. I opened the binder and laid it flat. "Mrs. Bishop is right about one thing," I said, looking out at the sea of hostile faces. "This is about rules, so let's talk about them." I held up the first document. "This is my property deed. It was recorded on May 12, 2010. The Evergreen Glade CC and Rs were filed on September 3, 2018. My property predates this entire HOA by more than 8 years. Under state law, that means your rules do not apply to me. That is the first rule." I then held up the notice for the unapproved stain color. "This is the lien for $5,000 that Mrs. Bishop placed on my home. It is an illegal lien. It is an attempt to force me to comply with rules that do not apply to me. That is the second rule she has broken, the one against filing frivolous and malicious legal actions." I continued, my voice never wavering. I held up the violation for my driveway, the fire pit, the vegetable garden. With each one, I stated the facts calmly and presented the evidence. The crowd was getting quieter. The angry murmurs were being replaced by confused whispers. They had only heard Karen's side. They were now being confronted with documented reality. Then I moved to the stories of the others. "This isn't just about me," I said, my gaze sweeping the room. I motioned to Mrs. Gable. "Ask Mrs. Gable about her roses. Ask her why she was forced to destroy a garden her late husband planted. And then look at Article 7, Section 2 of your own bylaws, which grandfathers in any landscaping that existed prior to a rule change. Her garden was there a year before the new rule was passed." I pointed to Marcus. "Ask this veteran why he's being fined for a disability ramp that doesn't meet aesthetic standards, when federal law, the Fair Housing Act, makes it illegal to deny a reasonable accommodation for a disability. That's a federal law Karen is breaking." The mood in the room had shifted dramatically. The anger directed at me was curdling into suspicion directed at the podium. People were looking at Karen, then at the uncomfortable board members, then back at me. They were starting to realize they had been lied to. Finally, I came to the water. "Now let's talk about the water," I said, my voice dropping slightly. "Mrs. Bishop tells you I am trying to hold you hostage. The truth is, your entire community has been held hostage since the day it was built, not by me, but by incompetence." I held up the developer's plan, the one with the hydrologist warning. "This is the original development plan for Evergreen Glade. This note from 15 years ago says the entire project is contingent on securing senior water rights from Parcel 7A. That's my land. They knew they needed my water rights, but they never got them. They built your homes, took your money, and left you completely vulnerable." I paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "For years, I have allowed this community to use my water, free of charge. I had no reason not to. And how was I repaid? With a campaign of harassment designed to steal my land." I closed the binder. "I did not start this fight. I am not your enemy. My notice to reclaim my water rights was not the first shot. It was the response to a war declared on me by your president." I looked directly at Karen. Her face was pale, her smug certainty replaced by a look of pure, venomous rage. "I am not an unreasonable man," I said, turning back to the crowd, "but I will not be bullied, and I will not have my property rights trampled." I went back to my spot against the wall. The silence was absolute. Then a woman in the middle of the room stood up. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Did you know about the water rights, Karen?" Karen stammered. "It's a complicated legal issue. He's twisting the facts." "It's a simple question," another man shouted. "Do we or do we not have a legal right to our water?" All eyes were on Karen. The power had shifted. It no longer resided at the podium. It was in the binder on the table, in the questions from the crowd. She had lost control of the room. She had lost control of the narrative. And in that moment, she knew it. The meeting devolved into chaos, but it was a chaos directed not at me, but at the board. My allies and I slipped out quietly. As we walked into the cool night air, Mrs. Gable put a hand on my arm. "You did it, John," she said, tears in her eyes. You gave them the truth. The battle of the clubhouse was won. But the war wasn't over. Karen was cornered, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous. The fallout from the community meeting was swift and seismic. The news that their entire water supply was built on a legal house of cards spread through Evergreen Glade like a wildfire. The carefully constructed reality Karen had maintained for years had been shattered in a single evening. My phone started ringing. It wasn't just my allies anymore. It was other residents. People who had applauded Karen at the start of the meeting were now calling me. Some apologetic, others terrified, all of them asking the same question. What happens now? I gave them all the same answer. Talk to your board. The power to fix this is in their hands, not mine. Dave had been right. By exposing Karen's incompetence, we had transferred the pressure from me to her. The 30-day deadline on my notice was no longer my problem. It was hers. Karen, however, was not one to admit defeat. Her response was to double down. 2 days after the meeting, a camera crew from a local news station appeared at my gate. Karen had gone to the media. She was spinning a new tale now. The beleaguered community president fighting a legal loophole being exploited by a wealthy landowner. She was trying to win in the court of public opinion what she had lost in the court of public assembly. The reporter, a young, ambitious woman named Sarah Jenkins, shouted questions at me through the gate. Mr. Miller, is it true you're going to cut off the water for 200 families? Karen Bishop says you're trying to force the community to buy your land at an inflated price. Do you have any comment? Instead of shouting back, I unlocked the gate and invited her in. I led her to the same dining table where I'd spread out my documents weeks before. I offered her a coffee and then I walked her through the entire story, just as I had at the meeting. I showed her the binder. I let her film the deed, the illegal lien, the frivolous violations, the developer's plans. I gave her the phone numbers for Mrs. Gable and Marcus. I didn't just give her my side of the story, I gave her the evidence to prove it. Don't take my word for it, I told her. Verify it yourself. The county records office is open from 9 to 5. She left my cabin 2 hours later, her expression completely different from when she'd arrived. The story that aired that night was not the one Karen had hoped for. It opened with a shot of the Lien, followed by a close-up of my vegetable garden. The headline wasn't "Greedy Loner Threatens Town." It was HOA Under Fire, President Accused of Harassment, Endangering Community's Water Supply. The report featured a powerful interview with a tearful Mrs. Gable standing over her empty rose beds, and another with Marcus, who explained how the HOA was ignoring federal law regarding his disability ramp. The news station had, in fact, gone to the county records office and confirmed every single one of my claims, including the seniority of my water rights. The segment ended with a legal analyst explaining that the HOA was in a catastrophically weak legal position and that Karen Bishop's actions had exposed the association to massive liability. The public exposure was a devastating blow to Karen's authority. The other board members, who had stood by her silently, were now in full-blown panic mode. They were being bombarded with angry calls and emails from residents. Their own lawyer, a slick corporate type who had initially dismissed my claims, was now warning them that they were facing a potential class action lawsuit from their own members for gross negligence. Desperate, Karen tried one last foolish gambit. She had the HOA's lawyer file for an emergency injunction in county court to prevent me from tampering with the community's water infrastructure. It was a move born of pure desperation. Dave and I met them in court. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, read the HOA's filing, then looked at the response Dave had prepared, which included the key documents from my binder. She listened to the HOA's lawyer for less than 5 minutes before cutting him off. Let me get this straight, she said, peering over her glasses at him. Your client, the HOA, has been harassing this man, filing illegal liens against his property, which is not part of your association, and now you want me to issue an injunction to prevent him from exercising his own senior water rights? Rights your client has been infringing upon for years? Am I understanding that correctly? The lawyer stammered. Well, Your Honor, the potential harm to the community? The harm to the community was created by your client's incompetence and malfeasance, the judge snapped. Motion for injunction denied. And counsel, I'd advise you to have a very serious conversation with your client about mitigating their damages before this gets any worse for them. Get out of my courtroom. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. Dave clapped me on the back. Checkmate, he said. The legal avenues were closed. The court of public opinion had turned against her. The residents were in open revolt. Karen had nowhere left to go. The 30-day clock was still ticking. Only 10 days remained. The panic in Evergreen Glade reached a fever pitch. There were rumors of people buying up bottled water, of real estate agents getting calls from panicked homeowners wanting to sell. The perfect, tranquil community was fracturing under the weight of its own flawed foundation. The board, minus Karen, called an emergency closed-door session. I later learned from one of my sources that it was a bloodbath. The other 4 members, facing personal liability and the wrath of their neighbors, finally turned on her. They demanded she resign. She refused, screaming that they were cowards, that she was the only one with the strength to fight me. The board was paralyzed. They were terrified of her, but they were more terrified of the consequences of her actions. The community was a ship heading for an iceberg, and the captain was insane, refusing to turn the wheel. It was clear they would not or could not resolve this themselves. The resolution would have to happen on my terms, at a time and place of my choosing, and I knew exactly where that would be. On the morning of the 30th day, the final day of the notice, I picked up a large, rusty wrench from my workshop and began walking toward the northern edge of my property, toward an old, forgotten piece of iron sticking out of the ground. The 30th day dawned clear and cold. A sense of finality hung in the air, sharp as the scent of pine. The media had been camped out on the county road since sunrise. Word had spread like gospel. Today was the day the water would stop. At 10 a.m. sharp, I walked out of my cabin. I wasn't alone. Dave was by my side, his briefcase in hand. Walking with us were Mrs. Gable, the Rodriguez family, and Marcus, his Air Force veteran cap pulled down low. We were a small, determined coalition, a physical representation of everyone Karen had tried to silence. We walked not with anger, but with a quiet, solemn purpose. Our destination was a small, grassy clearing on my property, about 50 yards from the road, where an old, rusted cast-iron wheel stuck out of the ground. It was the original gate valve for the spring that fed Miller Creek, installed by Silas Croft's grandfather a century ago. It was a primitive but effective mechanism. A few turns of that wheel would constrict the main underground channel from the spring, reducing the creek's flow to a mere trickle. It was a tool that hadn't been used in generations, but it was my right to use it. As we approached the valve, we saw the crowd. It seemed like the entire population of Evergreen Glade was there, standing on the other side of my dilapidated wire fence. They were a nervous, murmuring mass. The news cameras were there, their lenses like predatory eyes. And at the front of the crowd, pressed against the fence, was Karen. Her face was a grotesque mask of fury, her knuckles white where she gripped the wire. The other board members stood behind her, looking pale and defeated. I ignored the cameras, ignored the crowd, and walked directly to the valve. I knelt, cleared away some of the grass from its base, and fitted the large wrench onto the wheel's spindle. The metallic clank echoed in the sudden silence. Every eye was on that wrench. "Don't you dare!" Karen shrieked, her voice cracking. "You do this, and I'll have you arrested. This is terrorism. You're destroying people's lives." I didn't look at her. I looked at the crowd. I saw the fear in their faces, the uncertainty. They were still trapped between her narrative and the truth. It was time to give them a way out. I stood up, leaving the wrench on the valve, and walked to the fence line, stopping a few feet from Karen. "This was never about your water," I said, my voice carrying over the crowd. "This was never about money. This was about respect. It was about the right to be left alone, a right your HOA president refused to grant me, or Mrs. Gable, or Marcus, or the Rodriguez family." I looked past Karen to the other board members. "Your president has led you to the edge of a cliff. She has lied to you. She has abused her power, and she has put every one of your homes at risk through her arrogance and incompetence." I then addressed the entire community. "I am not the monster she makes me out to be. I don't want to turn off your water. I want to live in peace. But peace requires justice." Dave stepped forward and opened his briefcase. He produced a single document. "This is a covenant," I explained. "A new agreement. It's very simple. I laid out the terms, my voice clear and unwavering. First, the Evergreen Glade HOA will immediately and permanently drop the illegal lien on my property. Second, all outstanding fines and violations against me, Mrs. Gable, Marcus, and the Rodriguez family will be rescinded, with a formal letter of apology issued to each. Third, the current HOA board will be dissolved, and a new fair election will be held within 60 days. Karen Bishop will be barred from ever holding a position on the board again. A gasp went through the crowd. I was dictating the complete and unconditional surrender of their government. In return for these actions, I continued, I will do two things. First, I will not turn this valve. Not today, not ever. Second, I will grant the community of Evergreen Glade a formal, permanent water easement for a fee of $1 per year. I let that hang in the air. I was offering them not destruction, but salvation. I was solving the single greatest threat to their community's existence, a problem Karen had created, and I was asking for nothing more than justice and to be left alone. The ball was in their court. Karen started screaming again, a torrent of insults and threats. You can't do this. The board answers to me. I will sue you into oblivion. But no one was listening to her anymore. They were all looking at the document in Dave's hand. They were looking at the wrench on the valve. They were looking at each other. A man from the crowd, one of the board members who had stood silently behind Karen at the meeting, finally spoke up. His name was Tom, and he looked like a man who had reached his breaking point. That's enough, Karen, he said, his voice shaking but firm. It's over. It's not over, she shrieked. You're cowards, all of you. Tom ignored her and looked at me. We agree, he said. We agree to your terms. You don't have the authority, Karen screamed, lunging at him. Two other homeowners stepped between them, holding her back. The facade had shattered. The queen had been deposed, not in a quiet boardroom, but in public, in front of the entire kingdom she had terrorized. The HOA's own lawyer, who had been standing grimly in the background, stepped forward. As legal counsel for the HOA, I advised the board to accept Mr. Miller's proposal immediately. It is an incredibly generous offer that absolves the association of immense legal and financial liability. He looked at the four board members, all in favor of accepting the covenant as proposed by Mr. Miller? Tom's hand shot up. Aye. One by one, the other three members raised their hands. Aye. 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 The motion passes, the lawyer said, his voice devoid of emotion. Karen, you are hereby removed as president, effective immediately. It was done. The public humiliation was total. Karen stood there, held back by her own neighbors, her face contorted in a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. She spat one final, incoherent curse at me, then wrenched herself free and stormed away, pushing through the crowd, a tyrant without a throne. I watched her go, feeling not triumph, but a grim sense of satisfaction. Then I turned back to the valve. I knelt, picked up the wrench, and gave the wheel a symbolic quarter turn to the right, tightening it, securing the flow. Then I took the wrench off and stood up. I looked at Tom and the other humbled board members. We have an agreement, I said. The water would keep flowing. The war was over. In the weeks that followed, the transformation of Evergreen Glade was remarkable. The oppressive quiet was replaced by the sound of a community healing. The day after the confrontation at the fence line, Dave delivered the signed covenant to the new interim board. The lien on my property vanished from the county records. Formal letters of apology, printed on official HOA letterhead, arrived in the mailboxes of my allies. Mrs. Gables was particularly moving. The board not only rescinded her fines but also allocated funds for a landscape architect to help her design and replant a new rose garden, which they named the Eleanor Gable Memorial Garden, in honor of her resilience. It was a small gesture, but it signified a monumental shift from punitive rules to restorative community. The election for the new board was held 60 days later, as stipulated. Tom, the board member who had first stood up to Karen, was elected the new president. Mrs. Gable, emboldened by her victory, ran for and won the position of secretary. Marcus, the veteran, was appointed head of a new architectural review committee tasked with rewriting the rules to be compliant with federal law and guided by reason rather than whim. They immediately overhauled the CC&Rs, adding clauses to protect pre-existing properties and establishing a fair and transparent appeals process. The culture of fear that Karen had cultivated for years dissipated, replaced by one of collaboration and common sense. My own life returned to the quiet I had so desperately craved, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the quiet of isolation, but the quiet of peace. Neighbors from Evergreen Glade would sometimes walk up my gravel driveway, not with violation notices, but with plates of cookies or invitations to a neighborhood barbecue. They started calling the trail that ran along the creek the Miller Trail. I'd see families having picnics by the water, their kids laughing and skipping stones. The creek that had been a point of contention had become a bridge between my world and theirs. One Saturday, Chloe came to visit. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sun filter through the pines. "You know, Dad," she said, looking out at the woods, "I learned more about the law from your binder than I have in a whole semester of torts class. You didn't just win, you taught a whole community about due process." I thought about that. I hadn't set out to be a teacher or a revolutionary. I had just wanted to protect my home. But in defending my own small patch of ground, I had inadvertently liberated an entire community. I had shown them that a single determined person, armed with the truth in a well-documented binder, could stand up to a tyrant and win. The victory wasn't in Karen's public downfall, satisfying as that was. The real victory was in the quiet that followed. The sound of children playing by the creek, the sight of Mrs. Gable tending her new roses, the knowledge that a community, once poisoned by power, had found a way to heal itself. My greatest weapon had never been the water rights. That was just the leverage, the tool I used to bring the conflict to a head. My real weapon was Karen's own arrogance. She had been so convinced of her own power, so blinded by her obsession with control, that she couldn't see the fatal flaw in her own foundation. She had picked a fight over the color of a house, and in doing so, lost an entire kingdom. The ultimate irony was that in her quest to make my property conform to her world, she had forced her world to conform to my principles. A few months later, I was out checking my fence line when I saw Tom, the new HOA president, walking up the trail. He wasn't carrying a clipboard or a violation notice. He was carrying a fly rod. "Morning, John," he said with a friendly wave. "Mind if I try my luck in your creek?" "Not at all," I said, smiling. "The water's for everyone." We stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of the water rushing over the rocks, the very water that had almost torn us apart, now the thing that brought us together. He cast his line into a deep pool, the morning sun glinting off the water. It was a perfect picture of peace, a peace that had been hard-won. I looked back at my cabin, its dark walnut stains standing out proudly against the greens and browns of the forest. It was a testament not just to the work of my hands, but to the simple, powerful idea that a man's home is his castle, and no self-proclaimed queen has the right to tear it down. The lien was gone, the threat was gone, and Karen was a bitter memory. All that remained was the land, the creek, and the quiet, enduring satisfaction of justice served.